Hello, today's lesson is over the French Revolution. So the French Revolution happened in 1789. And the main thing to understand about France is its social system. So France's social system was broken up into three classes or called estates. So there's the first estate, the second estate, and third estate. The first estate is made up of the church. And it's the first estate because it gets you into heaven. So it's very important because if you want to go to heaven, you need to listen to what they say. And so they gave a lot of advice to the second estate. The second estate is the nobility. The nobility was in charge of making all the laws and running the country. So they're the ones that are responsible largely for this mess that you see over here to the left. They decide who paid taxes, who didn't pay taxes, who got land, who didn't, and basically, like I said, just how the country ran. The third estate was everyone else. So when I say everyone else, I do mean everyone else. So when you look at this picture, everyone else in this picture is probably a third estate. So you could be a soldier, a baker, a banker. You could be a millionaire if you're part of the third estate, and it still doesn't matter because you're never going to move up to the nobility ever. So now, why did the French Revolution happen? Well, if you look over to this picture over here, you'll notice that people are handing out what looks like bread to all these people. Well, the first reason and most immediate reason is famine. So famine is when basically you run out of food and are starving. So France had a terrible harvest and a lot of food went bad. Like a lot of food wasn't grown properly. And so they ran out of food. Secondly, France was bankrupt. So France helped out the American Revolution with lots of money, and they also fought against the British, which cost lots of money. And by the end of the American Revolution, France was bankrupt. It had no money, which meant that it had no money to buy food when the famine happened. So all these people got rather angry. And then pair that up with the fact that these people over here had not had a say in how things went over hundreds of years. They were rather annoyed with the system of government that was just failing them. And so they started protesting and rising up, and the king had to do something. And his solution to doing something was the Estates General. Now, what is the Estates General, you ask? The Estates General is essentially France's Congress. And it hadn't been called for over hundreds of years because the king and the nobility just made the laws by themselves. Whatever they thought became law. Now, the Estates General was made up of representatives from both the first, second, and third estate. And basically, the first and second estate wanted to run the country the Estates General, how they've run the country for hundreds of years, which is just with their input and no input from the third estate. The third estate wanted to have all sorts of say in how things were going because clearly the nobility and the church hadn't been running France correctly, or else they wouldn't be here in the first place. So, after days and weeks and months of having no say, the third estate just leaves. And the French king's like, whatever, let them go. We can run the country without them. We have all this time before anyways. Well, the problem is the third estate didn't just leave. They found this empty tennis court you see in the picture and took what's called the tennis court oath and formed the National Assembly. Now, that tennis court oath basically said that we will not leave or disperse until we've created a new national constitution. And the important thing to remember here is that the third estate is roughly like 90% of the population of France. And you can't have a government without 90% of the population. So the first estate and second estate eventually started coming over with the National Assembly to get their ideas. And eventually all of it went over there. And the National Assembly, the third estate, had one rule. Everyone had equal say. Therefore, it doesn't matter if the third estate never ran things before, you're going to listen to the third estate because, well, this is our thing and we're 90% of the population. So they had to go along with it, and the first and second estate did. And what they ended up creating was not a constitutional monarchy. So you still have a king, but you also have a constitution. However, the king wasn't very happy with losing his power because all kings like power. Like, rawr, strong. And he started gathering up his military might. He started gathering all the ammo, guns, and cannon in this castle you see behind you called the Bastille. Now, the problem was the Bastille wasn't heavily guarded or fortified for whatever reason, despite having all these guns and ammo and cannon, and the French people assaulted it because they saw what the French king was doing and knew he could only be using all of this or gathering all this material if he's planning on putting down the National Assembly and stopping their revolution and stopping their ability to have equal rights and an equal say in the government. And they weren't very happy. So they took all the king's guns, ammos, and cannon, which meant that the French military had none of that, which meant the French king could do nothing about what was to come next, which was the Declaration of Rights of Man. Now, as you can see here, the Declaration of Rights of Man was made in 1789, and it declared all men are born and remain free and equal in rights. So regardless if you are king or just a commoner, you are equal. In the eyes of this Constitution, you are equal. It also says that everyone has natural rights of life, property, and security, which sounds very similar to the Declaration of Independence for the U.S. of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It also importantly says everyone can participate in making law. So every citizen has the right to participate personally in the government, which was a radical change from how things used to be. And this didn't please a lot of the nobility or the king because they're used to having power and wanted to keep power. However, the revolution didn't stop here with changing how things worked. Remember, the first estate was the church, and they wanted to change how things worked with the church as well. So the church's people, like the bishops, the cardinals, and priests, were all chosen by the Pope in Rome. And they only responded to the Pope. And the people didn't like this. They wanted to be able to choose their own priests and cardinals and bishops. So they took that power away from the Pope and just made it their own, which was also radically different. They also seized all the church's land. So the church owned about 30 to 40% of the land, and after this, the National Assembly seized all that land and sold it for money to help fund the new government. And like I said, this angered a lot of people. Now, when they made the Declaration of Rights of Man and made the government a constitutional monarchy, so you have a king and a constitution, King Louis here had to go along with it because he knew if he didn't go along with it at the face of it, then he would be removed from power. So he would no longer be king. So he played along with this for as long as he could until he was able to get help from Austria. So the reason he was relying on Austria was because the King of Austria was the Queen of France's brother. And Louis knew that if he could get to Austria, he could get an army and come back and take back his country. So in the middle of the night, he left France, and he left Paris, actually, and he took his entire family and fled. He did not make it to Austria, and he was actually captured and brought back, which is how we end up in this picture where he's in handcuffs on a scaffolding. Now, the French revolutionists put him on trial for treason and found him guilty, actually, and sentenced him to death by guillotine. And Louis lost his head, and the French Revolution moved into a much more violent period of time. But for now, that is the end of our lesson.